Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining the Recrafting Performance Management for an Agile World Mastermind series with Aisling Taylor, the founder and CEO of our Tandem, and London Business School professor Julian Birkinshaw. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Mihai Noy. I'm the partner and head of content here at the Agile Congress. This is an absolute delight and privilege. And just before we start, let me begin with some housekeeping. First of all, please do not hit the share audio video button on your screen when you come to the enter in the lecture hall, because that will bring you up here on the virtual stage with me. And so unless you are ready to hold and lead this lecture, please just don't share your screen audio. So I need to deactivate some of you, unfortunately, did so. So I would like to keep this session as interactive as possible. And here are a couple of options. I hope you like our platform. Hop in, take a look at the chat box. Please keep the questions coming at the comments, and also make your voice heard by joining the polls and adding your views in the poll area. And if you have some specific questions and answers, just come to the Q&A tab. You find all this on the right navigation bar in the Hopin platform. Now, the topic of today's mastermind is recrafting performance management for an agile world. I mean, what a terrific topic. What an important topic it is. After all, we all know that performance management, as we know it, has not really delivered the expectation, has not really lived up to the expectation, neither the organization nor the people in the organization. After all, a very simple example, where if you or when you receive an email or a phone call from your boss asking you, come on a Zoom meeting, come to my office, hopefully in the near future, let's talk about your performance. How many of you start jumping up and down in joy that what a great opportunity, we are going to talk about my development, my growth, how I can excel at work, how I can fulfill myself, how I can be a better contributor to the organization, to the greater society, to myself, how can I achieve self-actualization at work? Is this what goes through your mind? Or, what did I really screw up? Unfortunately, sadly, the latter is more often than the first. So here we are to find out how we need to recraft, how we need to rethink performance management so that it's truly developmental, so that it truly delivers value to both the organization and the employees and people in the organization. And who is better person to give us some ideas than a former Agile director, Aisling Taylor, who actually before starting our Tandem, she held very senior Agile roles at Telefonica, at O2, at SAP, and then she became an entrepreneur, started our Tandem. So she walks the talk. She knows exactly what goes through in Agile people's life, in Agile people's mind. And the other person is Julian Birkinshaw, Thinkers 50 London Business School professor, who's going to talk about unlocking motivation at work. After all, we cannot achieve true performance and true engagement unless people are truly motivated and aligned and engaged at work. So it's an absolute pleasure and delight, and please do keep questions coming. And let me bring on our virtual stage our first keynote speaker, Aisling Taylor, the founder and CEO of our Tandem. Aisling, it's such a delight. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Mihai. Great to be here.
And now the virtual stage is all yours. We are all eager to hear how to reimagine performance management in an agile world.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks so much. And hi to everybody who's joined us today. Great to be here with you all. I'm going to try and share a presentation if my technology skills are up to it. Let's see. Are you guys seeing my presentation right now? I'm not hearing you, Mahali. Have I lost you?
No, I just came off stage, but yes, we see you and hear you perfectly.
And can you see the presentation?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
You
it's
do?
Not in a slideshow yet. Now it's in a slideshow. Perfect.
Oh, wonderful. Good. Off to a good start. At least we've got the tech working. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next few minutes just talking to you about how we can reimagine that performance management experience for an agile world. And I have the good fortune of talking to companies pretty much every day of the week, some who are already fully immersed in Agile practices, some who are trying to get there, and some who are a bit taken aback how much Agile has taken over their world and they're trying to catch up. But whether we're planning intentionally to be in an Agile world or not, we all are. And I think the last year has accelerated that enormously. So I think we were going to try and run a poll to see how many of you are already fully immersed in Agile practices and how many are planning on getting there. I don't know if Mihai has a poll for me there, but hopefully
he's... stage with you, ladies and gentlemen. Please go to the polls tab next to the right-hand side. You see the navigation, and you have chat, polls, and Q&A. So please go to the polls area, and the question is your organization currently working Agile?
Okay, brilliant. So I'm sure you'll share the results with that as they arrive.
Yes, the numbers are coming in. 56%, 57% is yes, we are working towards it. 23%, no, we have not started yet. And 20% now is dropped down to 18%, yes, fully.
Okay, all right. So lots of you trying to get there in some shape or form. And I think what's interesting about moving toward a much more agile world, and indeed, I would say that we've all moved to a more agile world, regardless of whether you're practicing the methodologies around it or not. The complexity that's layered on top with dispersed teams and remote working, I think brings a new dimension to it that makes it even that little bit more complicated to execute flawlessly. So I want to talk to you about maybe how we can frame and shape our practices around that, ensuring that we can deliver to an agile world. So when we think about moving to Agile, there's an awful lot of implications that happen. And often I meet organizations who've been kind of caught almost unawares, and their organizations are in these working practices before they've had time to really think through, well, how do we in HR respond? But some of the things to think about in this world that may influence our practices are things like we're moving from a world of one very clear defined manager to multiple project managers. So it's quite common for people to have 2, 3, up to 5 or 6 project managers during any one year. And of course, the implications of that on performance are huge. And it's also a world, you know, remember, I don't know if any of us even remember anymore the days where we had these very safe and steady annual goals. I think that world is well behind us, and it's been replaced by much more short-term, reiterative and evolving goals that change all the time. We're also kind of moving from that world of 1 or 2 defined points in the year of very formalized feedback, you know, done through an appraisal or review process. And now we have to think about a world where we're capturing feedback as we go through the year, either through end of project reviews or indeed real-time feedback as we move through those milestones and then those shorter term goals. So we need processes around capturing the feedback in the moment that it matters. And I think we've all familiar with the idea of cascading goals and the leadership team bringing their goals through the organization. But now we're seeing a huge amount of bottom-up alignment as well as cascade down. So even during the pandemic, it was the frontline staff who were often setting the agenda because they were hearing from customers, you know, what the organization needed to do differently in order to respond to some of the challenges the pandemic set. So you had messages and information and almost re-goal setting happening at the very front line of the organization, and messages and goals moving back up the organization, up top to the CEO. So we couldn't sit in a world where we were waiting on the CEO to set the direction because that would have been too slow. And so we see an awful lot more agility around how goals come through the organization, both from a top-down perspective and also a bottom-up perspective. The other thing that I think is really interesting to think about is, you know, in the past, we had a very clear community. If you went into an organization, you probably did your 9 to 5 or a lot more, Monday to Friday, and you had a very clear team to work with. And now that's not so much the case. You're probably working in multiple teams. They could be cross-functional teams. And even I talk to 4 or 5 organizations a day. It's very common that I turn up a call on a call. There's maybe 15 or 20 people on that call, and a lot of them are introducing themselves to each other. They don't even know each other, and yet they have a huge decision to make together. So this world where we're part of multiple teams, I think, is interesting. And Mark Mortensen writes beautifully on this topic, because he talks about people showing up, not knowing who their colleagues are, and the sense of isolation and loneliness that can kick in when you're part of that dynamic. And finally, we're looking at a world where we used to have nice, neat, linear management structures, a very clear org hierarchy, to a slightly messier structure, which is probably more matrix oriented and might require different people who don't even have managerial responsibilities in their brief, that they need to be able to assign goals to other people in this organization. So the world of only managers and leaders assigning goals is probably gone. Now we need multiple people to be able to pick up and assign goals to anybody as we work through those matrix structures. So it's a very different world from the one that we came. And while performance management served us very well in the from world, where we had clarity on who the manager was and the goals and the formalized feedback, and that's a very kind of neat and tidy world, a lot of what we did doesn't work for the world of Agile. And we work in Agile in tandem every day of the week. And one of the interesting things, I think, is that there's a huge amount of feedback runs in an Agile environment. Everything from your stand-up meetings in the morning to your retrospectives to where are we at with a sprint? Are we behind or ahead? And what are the tasks and activities and stories that you have to do that need to catch up? So there's a lot of feedback that happens in this world, but it's feedback on tasks and on activities. It's not feedback on me, the human. How am I doing? You know, who's recognizing me for all this hard work? How am I growing and developing here? So all of those things can get really lost in that world. And I was working with a client who had entered that world unbeknownst to themselves. So the organization had formed themselves around tribes and squads and were working fully Agile. And the feedback that they were getting from their people was, nobody cares about me in all of this. I'm in multiple project teams. I'm delivering quicker and more fast-paced than I ever did before. And yet nobody seems to notice how I'm doing. So that makes us think about the challenges that might come with the world of Agile. There's definitely more potential for conflict because you're working at such a pace, there's such a delivery, and you don't necessarily work with the same tribe every day that you're used to working in. So you can have that fragmentation on community. And of course, if you don't have someone to let off steam with and you don't have that release valve, you can start to get a bit exhausted by the whole thing. And burnout is a very real thing. And it's interesting. I was talking to some HR consultants recently, and they said the amount of stuff they're dealing with on conflict and burnout lately. And you can call it, you know, from the pandemic, or you can call it from people being exhausted from endless Zooms and Teams meetings. But it's a very real challenge out there. And Agile compounds that challenge. So in reverse, we have to dial up the areas of well-being to make sure that our people are doing okay, development so they know we care about them, and appreciation so that we know we see how much they're delivering. And those are the areas that were probably not the most well-serviced areas in our traditional performance management frameworks. You know, tackling well-being wasn't really a big thing back then. Development was kind of the thing that was squeezed in at the end of the forum and the appraisal review meeting. And appreciation might have happened, but it was sandwiched in between constructive feedback. So if we're going to start rethinking, how can we really emphasize those areas? We might need to think about the new employee experience that we can lead the way on. And what I would say is, if your organization is moving to Agile practices, make sure you get a seat at that table and influence those practices right up front. Because chasing behind and trying to catch up by, you know, reforming HR processes around those practices can be a much harder journey than being ahead of it. But if you sit back and think about the drivers of the employee experience and what is really important to insert into your performance management frameworks, we need to really think about the experience that the employee is going through in this world of Agile. So areas like growth and development, it's an absolute must have. If you're going to be in a world where you're expecting that kind of fast paced, that demanding environment, that does produce incredible results, by the way, that does kind of lead to huge levels of productivity. So there's a lot to be said for this world, but we have to take care of the growth and development journey on it. And we have to make sure that people still have a voice and are heard as individuals, and that they feel like they belong to a community and they're part of a tribe, and they're not just this lost kind of cog in a wheel in the whole event. Leadership has always been important in performance management, but probably more important than ever. But I think we ask a lot of our leaders in this environment because they no longer have the tools that they used to have. They used to have full visibility of what my employee is up to every day of the week. They used to assign and assess those goals. They used to be able to review and appraise how strong the performance was that year. Now, chances are they have employees who they may not see from one end of the day to the next. They don't know if those employees are working 18 hours a day at home behind their team's environments, or whether they're working 8 hours, who knows. And they also don't get to see the same level of visibility of that person's performance. How are they contributing in team meetings? What's their delivery like? What kind of goals were they even dealing with on those multiple projects? Often they lose sight of all of that, but we still need them to give that clear growth and direction. So it's a big ask, and I think we have to help leaders with tools to enable them to do that job well now. But we've got to dial up the appreciation, the recognition piece, and really importantly, the purpose, so that people can see, I see where I fit in this world. So it doesn't matter if you're the gardener, the receptionist, the call center agent, the retail staff, wherever you sit in the organization, you see how what you do every day links to a bigger picture and a bigger piece of your community. So looking at a culture in an agile world, we've got to think about some of the practicalities of what's really going to work. And often I go into organizations and they're already working fully agile, but somebody somewhere is still trying to force them into SMART goals. And those two worlds don't really collide very well anymore. Or they've tried OKRs, but and OKRs work beautifully in smaller organizations, but in a 100,000 person organization, it can be hard to execute it perfectly. Regardless of which goals framework you're attached to, there's two elements that just have to be there. One is we've got to be able to cascade goals really quickly and really transparently throughout the organization. It can't be this long, arduous process that it might have been. I remember at one point when we used cascade goals in one of my former employers, it was 3 months before they actually hit the average employee, because it was so complex to convert them at every stage. But we've got to be able to do it like that. But more importantly, we've got to be able to bottom-up align them. So the call center agent may not see the relevance of the CEO's EBITDA target or their ESG goals, but they should be able to see my 20 calls a day leads to the department's wider statistics, and that leads to a customer satisfaction thing, which my CEO does care about, so they can see that line of sight back to the bigger purpose. I think as well, we've got to move away from the concept that we manage performance. I'm not sure we ever did manage anyone's performance. Let's face it, we all kind of own our own performance, and managers can encourage and coach us to get to a better place. But we've got to think about, how are we leading performance in this organization, and how do we change the mentality around that so that employees own their own development and leaders can coach and develop performance, even if they don't see every aspect of that employee's performance in the day. And two others, we've got to move away from sitting around waiting for the pulse survey to tell us whether people are happy or they're satisfied with our environments. We've got to craft employee experiences where we can measure what is the experience for an employee around here, and what does it look like for a graduate versus a manager who's been with us 10 years. What does it look like for a woman versus a man? So all of these different journeys and personas that we can map out and measure them at every point, so that we can practically predict what our pulse surveys are going to tell us. The big piece I think that we in HR have the opportunity to do is to put some real humanity into the whole process. And I think when we have agile organizations, it's so task focused, it's so output driven, it's so, and you can make leaps and bounds in your organizational output, which is fantastic. But we can't lose sight that there are humans behind these tasks. So there's a couple of things that we can do to really make sure that we've humanized the whole experience for our people. One is they deserve some feedback on how they're doing. They deserve to know where they stand. So making sure that feedback isn't this thing that, you know, we do once or twice a year, but that we're collecting it and we're giving it in the moment that it matters, so that the employee can change and adjust and adapt and, you know, change their capabilities throughout the year, and they're not waiting for these defined moments. Also, I see a huge shift in how we're doing check-ins, you know, and I've been surprised that there's not much written about it, but it's an enormous change. So what we're seeing HR departments do is being much more prescriptive about check-ins, helping managers through prompts, through agenda items, through discussion, little prompter moments, in saying, check in on the person's well-being, and having defined moments to check in on development, and stop trying to crush the well-being, performance and development conversation all into one conversation. Let's split them out and be clear about, when are we talking about you, the human, how you're getting on, the work-life balance, you know, your capability, any challenges you're meeting, versus when are we talking about you, the person who has the potential to grow even more around here and develop, versus when are we talking about you and your performance and how you stand, and whether you're on track or not, or whether you're doing great, or whether you need to keep your focus and develop in certain areas. So splitting out those check-ins and being really clear about the conversational points throughout, and then helping managers navigate that conversation is really, really key. There's two other pieces which I think are really linked. And one is, while managers may not be able to manage performance in the same way that they could in the past, they can manage growth. They can help employees grow and optimize their potential. So if we help them with lots of tools to focus on growth, then performance will follow, because if we grow, we're going to perform anyway. So giving managers great tools to help employees see how they can grow and helping them develop will be game-changing for any performance management framework. And finally, I think we need to move away from this concept that we're managing performance into inspiring potential, because there's a world of high performance waiting for us if we can inspire that little 10% that people aren't using today that they could bring to the organization. And we have to do it through technology. And the ironic thing is, we can create more humane practices through technology. Who'd have thought? But the beauty of technology is it gives us those moments, and it gives them sharper to us, because we can sustain and measure the experience at every point if we use technology. And I used to be driving everybody demented when I was a HRD, sending leaders on coaching programs, making sure they all had executive coaches, there was coaching refreshers. But it's hard to sustain those coaching concepts. And I was talking to somebody recently, and he was saying, you know, we have coaching frameworks for feedback, coaching frameworks for goals, we have frameworks for performance, we have frameworks for development. We're confusing the hell out of our people because we have so many frameworks. And the thing is, those things can be hard to retain. But actually, if you've just got a nice, neat piece of technology that goes, hey, you know, here's how to have a great check-in conversation, and here's some discussion starters for you, here's some prompters to navigate you through the conversation, then we can maintain that experience and keep it consistent and measure it over time and measure the improvements that we're making. So finally, can we reimagine the way that we lead performance in an organization? I really think we can, particularly if we keep the employee journey at the heart of it, thinking about the moments that matter most to them, thinking about where do they get growth, where do they get the performance conversation, how do we deliver it to them, but also equipping our leaders to be great coaches. And we don't need to plug them on a 3-month coaching program to do that. We can help them with the right tools and the right interventions at the right times. But as well, for a lot of people who are bringing in continuous performance management, some of the mistakes in the past that have been made are things like moving away from formal reviews, formal ratings, formal calibration, but not replacing it with structured moments of accountability. You know, we can't hope that people will talk about performance. We've got to carve it into the experience and make sure there's moments throughout the year, whether it's formal or informal, that we develop these moments where people can go, yeah, how are we doing? Where do we stand? Are we on track? Are we going to hit those goals? So that we still have those performance conversations, but we can have them with a developmental slant to them. So finally, from me to wrap up, that's what we do in Tandem every day. We help organizations with their performance management, and we design performance management, and we provide the technology to do it. And the beauty is that not everybody has to be the same. I don't believe that, to rate or not to rate, that there's one answer to that. I think it depends on the maturity and capability of your organization. But there's three core promises that we always keep. One is, we've got to rehumanize performance management, make humanity center stage at the core. We've got to grow the leadership capability while we're doing it. And we've got to drive that sense of community through engagement so that people feel part of something bigger than themselves. And I think if you hit those three promises, you've really come a long way in making sure that performance management is an inspiring experience for your people. So that's it from me. We'd love to talk to you. There's lots of contact details if you'd like to reach out and say hello, but that's it from me. And I'm going to hand back to Mihai in case there's any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Aisling. It was a very fast-paced presentation, but the good news is, ladies and gentlemen, Aisling will be staying around. So once we finish the session today, there is an hour Tandem Lounge. You find it under the sessions hall. So just come once we finish with the session and the interaction with Julian as well. Come to the our Tandem Lounge and let's have a conversation. Let's continue the conversation around recrafting performance management. If you do have a question right now, we have a bit of time, about 5 minutes. So please put it in a chat box, and we'll look for the questions. And let me start with a question. They've already said before that talent matters. Obviously, talent matters. Organizations matter more. An organization, in terms of organization performance, talent over team, it's 5-1. So it's 5 times more important to have the right organization than having just a talented team, talented people in our team. And also, one of my favorite movies is Moneyball, and we all know that we've seen Brad Pitt as a coach putting together a baseball team. None of them are super high performers, but putting them together in the right way, actually they managed to win the baseball league. So my question to you is about, when it comes to performance management, we always talk about the individual performance, which is of course very important to have the check-ins and the one-on-one conversations. How can we talk about how can be expanded to team performance management, considering the actual dynamics in a team that might hinder or actually boost performance?
Yeah, we see a huge shift to team performance and even team bonuses, team goals, much more emphasis on team. I think one of the things you have to be really careful about when you're constructing performance management, that you don't keep it just at the team level. There still has to be individual accountability within the team. So while you can bring transparency to your team goals, and you can have a very clear team goal that we're all working toward, we need to ensure that we're clear about who's doing what to achieve that goal. So if I've got a 10 mil sales target, I need to know that you're going to deliver 3 of it, and you're going to deliver another 2. And, so I need to know how it's comprised, and we need to be able to hold each other to account. So one of the things that's got really popular is transparency around both team goals and managers being able to see their team goals, but also to see the individual's accountability within that team goal, so that you can work both into the mix and everybody. And what I see more of, which was a surprise in the beginning, but a lot of people switching that on publicly for everyone to see. So a huge amount of transparency, particularly in agile organizations, where they can not only see what the team target is, but they can see everyone's individual target within that, and not just sales teams, but right across all functions. So it's a huge trend, and I think it's to be encouraged, because it encourages that sense of community as well.
Indeed, wonderful. It's working towards teal, and I know that Tim Oshinger is here with us in the audience from Leaf Sciences, and he's the one who created a teal around the world conference. And that's eventually, that would be nice to have this teal culture, which of course requires a lot of individual maturity in among team members. Question from the audience, Otti Fox is asking, Aisling, what is your inexperience the biggest obstacles to reforming performance management?
Readiness, I would say. And that, what I mean by that is the organization's capability to take on and people making sure that they've got their change management processes right. So often what we see is people have rushed ahead and put in continuous performance management practices. They've, maybe changed the way that they rate, or they've thrown out ratings, or they've thrown out calibration. But the managers, don't know how to operate in a world without those ratings, and they haven't readied them well enough for it. So they haven't put in kind of an intervention program or a technology to help guide the people through the new processes. So mass confusion arrives, and I've heard some horror stories around the kind of things that can happen when you get it really, really wrong. But I think one of the things that's really important to do is to diagnose, where's your starting point? Where are you as an organization right now? And to be very real with yourself there. And we do this diagnostic tool. And what's always interesting is, a lot of the time, even within the HR department, they can't agree on where they're at, whether they're a reactive culture, which means, feedback rarely happens, and it's, to a structured culture where, yes, it happens, but in very formal events. And often even within a HR team, they don't have agreement on where their starting point is. But as well as defining your starting point, where's the place that you're trying to get to, and how quickly can you get it there? So if you're starting as a reactive culture where feedback never happens and there's very little performance management at all, there's no point in trying to leapfrog into being an organic culture within 3 months. That's not real for you. Your people have to go on a journey, and you have to kind of bring them piece by piece by layering in different initiatives at different times. If you try to throw everything at them at once and go, do you know what we're going to do? Real-time feedback, check-ins, goals, you're all going to get a 360 and it's all going to be great. You're just going to overwhelm them, and they're not going to be ready, and there'll be a resistance to it. So I think it's taking it piecemeal, layering it in, and making sure that the people are ready and capable of taking on your next intervention as it comes.
And once you fail, people become cynical, so it will be even more difficult to re-energize, restart again. Thank you so much, Aisling. It's been absolutely brilliant. And ladies and gentlemen, don't forget, in the Our Tandem Lounge after the session, Aisling will be there, so let the conversation continue. And now it's my absolute pleasure to invite our guest speaker today, Julian Birkinshaw. Waiting for come on stage. There you go. Julian, delight having you here. Julian Birkinshaw is a London Business School professor, Thinkers 50 author. It's what a delight and privilege. This is not the first time we are working together, so I know exactly what probably many of the audience don't know yet, that they are better buckle up and get ready for a really insightful session, insightful presentation about rethinking Agile's new role in this agile world, and how we can unlock employee people motivation at work. Thank you so much for being here with us. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Mihai. And just to make sure that you can see my slides and everything, are we good?
All good, perfect.
Excellent, good. Well, thank you. And as you say, I'm going to be sharing a lot of ideas. There's going to be some very complementary stuff to what Aisling talked about, but I'm going to end up going in a slightly different direction, certainly towards the end. I don't have any polls, but I am going to encourage you to use the chat. And there's going to be a couple of times when I'm going to ask you a question. And in fact, let's just start with a question just to get you warmed up. Who are you happiest spending time with? Very simple question. You just got to choose one of the options on the screen there. And as I say, I'm not going to try to take any sort of definitive poll, but a few of you, if you're quick on the draw, I'll be able to look at what you have to say. Children, friends, spouse, myself, friend, spouse. Okay, I'm getting a good sense of what is coming out. I've got one person on their own. Good. So, and indeed, we've obviously over lockdown been getting used to spending more time on our own perhaps than we did before. But let me just tell you the official answer. This is Richard Layard, the economist. He did this survey many times over the years. It is the case that on average, we are happiest with our friends. And that's partly because when we see our friends, we are in sort of happy places. Whereas, of course, parents, kids, spouses, we live with them 24/7. That is interesting. But the really interesting point is the bottom. We are least happy with our boss. And indeed, we would prefer to be alone than with our boss. And that simple data point is the springboard for the first part of my talk, which is that I have been studying academically and also in terms of consulting work, what it takes to be a good boss. I've actually written a book on the subject. It's called Becoming a Better Boss. And I asked lots of people, tell me about your best boss. And of course, you get these sort of answers. I'm not going to read this out. You can read it for yourself. The best bosses inspire us. They give us lots of energy. They are curious. They want us to succeed. They are fulsome in their praise and so forth. And then when I ask people, tell me about your worst boss, I get even more answers from them. And I'm just going to give you one of the juiciest quotes I ever received. My worst boss thrived on creating stress for everyone around him. He couldn't give up control. He didn't have any time for the people side of things, and so on and so forth. And my guess is that many of you, particularly if you're seasoned managers, leaders, employees, you've had a few bosses who have some of those traits as well. And it's been a fascination for me for many years as to why it is that there are actually so many bad bosses out there. I don't think anybody goes to work in the morning thinking, I'm going to try to make my employees' lives miserable. And yet the truth is that in many cases, they end up doing exactly that. And that is a huge source of concern. And as I said, it led me to write a book about what a good boss actually does. What is it that makes a good boss? And I started researching the subject, and I discovered, partly to my disappointment, that in fact, there is no surprise under there in terms of what good bosses actually do. A number of studies had been done over the years answering that specific question already. One very famous one came out of Google, and it was called Project Oxygen. And Google, being Google, threw data at the problem. They actually did a huge survey of tens of thousands of people studying which of their employees had actually got good ratings as bosses, and to try to sort of correlate being a good boss with certain behaviors. And the answer to Google's study was the following. And again, I'm not going to go through the details of this, is that their 8-point advice on how to be a good boss. And this is part of what Google will tell people when they bring them in and give them managerial roles. And there's 2 points I want to get out of this list. Point number one is it's almost all about the people side of things. And in fact, if you look all the way to the bottom of the list, point number 8, technical skills. We think of Google people as being really good software engineers, right? And of course they are, but it turns out if you're going to be a good boss, really strong technical skills matters, but not as much as the other things on that list. It's all about the people stuff, the coaching and the not micromanaging and taking an interest in people's work. So that's point number one. And then point number 2 is that the list is actually pretty obvious. None of you is looking at that list saying, oh my gosh, suddenly now I know what I've been doing wrong. Chances are you're looking at this and saying, well, I recognize all of these things. And so that is really the point I'm trying to make here, which is there is no secret to what being a good boss involves. And if we're trying to make our organizations a better place, we've got to move from just drawing up lists like this of this is what a good boss should do, to actually trying to move the needle in terms of if we know what our bosses are supposed to do, or if we know what we're supposed to do, why is it that we're not doing it more consistently ourselves? And let me just summarize that point with this chart. On the left-hand side, this is what your employees are asking for. And Ashling's pretty much made the same point, so I can do it pretty quickly. They want purpose. They want you to tell them why this is important. They want to have space. They want to have autonomy. They want to have availability of support when it is required. They want recognition. They want praise. And my guess is you've heard that before. But unfortunately, and this is true for all of us if we're prepared to look in the mirror as well as look at our colleagues, unfortunately, this is not what our employees are getting all the time. And sometimes we have all fallen into the traps of giving unclear objectives, micromanaging, not providing as much information as we should, and actually holding back on our feedback and our praise. So here's my next question for you. It's a really simple question. Why is there a gap between the rhetoric and the reality? Let me ask it slightly differently. Why don't we consistently act as we know we should? And if again, I'm just going to wait sort of 20, 30 seconds here just to give a few of you who are eager and involved a chance to tap away at your computers. You know, why is it that we're not actually doing what we say we should? Someone saying the incentive system doesn't support it. People are people, and work gets in the way. The real work gets in the way. There are gaps in our capabilities. We've got pressures in our own jobs. Our ego, I love that point, Azad. I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to move on. I mean, really, you've already given me enough to work with, and I've got a lot of ground I want to cover in my 30 minutes. We don't know how to do it right. So, of course, the point is that every single answer you've just given me is sort of right. I mean, there's no completely stupid answers to this question, but we've got to try to make sense of these answers in terms of helping us to move forward. So I'm going to suggest, look, there's a bunch of valid answers on the left-hand side here. I don't have time. I've got conflicting objectives. I haven't had the necessary training. I'm not properly incentivized. I think that is superficially all correct. The one I have a bit of a trouble with is the first one, I don't have time. I think it is lazy thinking to say that I don't have time to do this stuff, because an awful lot of good management of others is actually delegating work to others, actually giving them really worthwhile things to do, taking things off your plate, structuring them well, and giving them to others. In the short term, that takes time, but even within a few weeks or months, chances are you have actually saved time. So I think that it's a bit narrow-minded to say that you don't have time, but I do ultimately accept that all these things have some truth. So I want us to move from the, shall we say, valid answers to what I think of as the better answers, which are underneath all these superficial problems about why we aren't doing what we know we should. There's a bunch of fairly kind of important psychological processes going on here. First of all, we absolutely get stuck in existing habits, whether those are good habits or bad habits, we get stuck into them. Another one is that we keep falling back on the behaviors that worked when we were younger, when we were more junior. What got you here won't get you there, is what Marshall Goldsmith says. In other words, to become successful up to one level, you have to be in control and you've got to deliver results. And then as you move into a managerial role, suddenly your job is about helping others to achieve things rather than doing everything yourselves. And of course, many of us have an ego problem. We have trouble letting go. And I'm going to come back to that point before I finish. So there's a gap between how we behave and how we should behave. And the starting point for realizing what we should do differently is indeed to understand those almost behavioral biases that we've got. Now, I want to just bring a specific lockdown point to bear here, because I've been doing some academic research over the last 12 months, looking particularly at how the virtual working environment has changed things. And unfortunately, it's actually changed things for the worse. I want to just give you another chance just to throw some thoughts out in chat. If you divide the work of a manager into three categories, there's the cognitive work, analysis, reflection, getting to the bottom of things, getting to the bottom of a problem. There is what we can call the relational work, which is about enabling and inspiring others, helping others to do their jobs well. And then there's what I think of as the action-oriented work, which is getting things done, getting projects completed. And very simple question, if you accept that there's a categorization into these three boxes, which of these three have you struggled with most during lockdown? In other words, when you have been working in your home offices, physically separated from your colleagues. And I just want to see a couple of thoughts. And again, there is no right or wrong. All I can give you is the statistically sort of significant findings from my research. And there's a bit of everything. I'm seeing literally all answers. If I have to choose one of them, it is the relational ahead of the cognitive or the action-oriented. And I'm going to tell you that the answer I got from my surveys is actually the relational one. And I want to just make a point here, which is about the methodology, which is that this is what you might call proper social science. In other words, I did a survey about 20 months ago before we even knew what COVID was. And the results of that survey are the dots on the graph here. In other words, before COVID was a thing, I asked people, tell me how good you are at all these different aspects of your management work. And so those are unbiased by anything that happened subsequently. So for example, understanding and motivating other people was the one which actually scored the highest. The right-hand side is a high score. I then did the same survey with a sample of people with the same characteristics during lockdown. This was June last year, so almost a year ago. And the red dots is the data I've got. So this is not people retrospectively making sense of a new world. This is independent or data collected rigorously. And the bottom line is, and I won't bore you with the statistics, the bottom line is that on average, and there's huge variation here, but on average, people found that they were actually more effective relative to all these other things during lockdown. Essentially, they're saying, look, I'm not being distracted so much. I'm actually able to put my head down and finish a report and work through a problem because I'm not in the distracting world of an office. When it comes to getting things done, on average, people were saying roughly it's the same. In other words, I am able, in fact, to pull the right people together to get things done in this lockdown situation. But, and this was true of all of these questions at the bottom here, when it came to the relational aspects of the work that I'm doing, I'm struggling. I am not as able to understand and motivate others. I'm not as able to get the best from my team. I'm not able to manage those difficult situations with my colleagues in the way that it used to be. And that is, I mean, objectively, if you like, statistically true. I see a question about will it change from culture to culture? Absolutely it will. But unfortunately, when you're only dealing with a couple of hundred responses, you can't kind of tease out those differences. So all I can give you is the headline kind of difference between pre and during lockdown. But nonetheless, I think this is important because all it says is that all the points I was making earlier about the challenges of becoming a better boss are actually exacerbated when we are working away from the office. I mean, perhaps that's not a surprise to anybody, but it is something which I think we've got to keep bearing in mind. And I will come back to that before I'm done. So if part one of my talk was all about the challenges that we're facing, part two of my talk is, of course, about what some of those solutions might look like. So if the risk we face is that our employees are a little bit disengaged, they're not happy, they are not bringing themselves to work as much as they might, and our managers, partly because of lockdown, are becoming a bit disconnected, we do need to make some changes. And I've got some thoughts. I'm not going to pretend these are comprehensive thoughts, and in some ways they dovetail quite nicely with some of the things that Aisling said. And I'm going to divide them into two categories. One is about the structures and processes that we use and at an organizational level, and the other is about what you might call the skills of our individual leaders. In other words, you can sort out the processes. You can also simply work on getting better people into positions of leadership across our organizations and coping with the dysfunctions of many large organizations. And if we're going to focus first on structures and processes, and this is a point I've made many times in the past, and I'm going to do it fairly quickly. A couple of you might have heard me say this before, but I'm very conscious that because the business world is complex, we sometimes have this sort of urge to fight complexity with complexity. And I actually think that is exactly the wrong way to do things. The world is too complex to predict. It's too complex to plan. What we need to do is essentially to simplify things, to essentially try to strip away the complexity of the organization so that the folks closer to the front line are able to figure things out for themselves. And many of you will have seen this video before. I'm only going to show it for 10 or 20 seconds. All I'm trying to say here is that metaphorically speaking, our organizations are a little bit like a traffic system in a city. This is Hyderabad in India. And we can choose to try to use traffic lights and markings on the road and all that good stuff that we have in most European countries, or we can choose to have a rather chaotic and sort of everybody does their own thing environment as we see here. And the whole point of that little video clip is simply to say, look, there's nobody telling these folks how to behave. There is no formal written rule of instructions about how you drive in a chaotic city center like that. Everybody figures it out. There is give and take between parties. There are an emergent set of rules that have taken shape over the months and years. But the point is that everybody more or less trusts each other to do the right things. Everybody trusts that there is competence in the organization. and it works pretty well. Not seamlessly, but it works pretty well. And indeed, attempts to bring that sort of chaotic form of traffic into Europe has been tried. This guy you see on the screen here, Hans Monderman, he was the pioneer of what's sometimes called shared space, which was exactly this. It was stripping out all the markings and traffic lights and things in city centres and town centres in order to get people to take responsibility for their own actions. So, and of course, it works quite well in European cities, just as it does in India. So again, it's just a simple metaphor, and it's a metaphor that hopefully you find useful to say to yourself, have we over-engineered our structures? And if we're working in HR, have we created actually a performance management system that is just more burdensome than it needs to be? And of course, we can't completely get rid of our systems and our budgeting processes and so forth, but we can absolutely dramatically simplify them. And I know many big organizations who have made great progress in this regard in order to try to simplify those sort of processes. So the organizational challenge here, I think, is to simplify, to delayer, to decentralize decision-making, to try to put an emphasis on speed and experimentation on the front lines. I've used the term adhocracy before now as an alternative to bureaucracy. If bureaucracy focuses on rules, adhocracy focuses on action. So in terms of my story, if you like, that is the sort of structural story I want to talk about today. There's much more I'd like to say here, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to hop over this slide and I'm going to make a couple of thoughts about hybrid working more generally, because I'm conscious that everybody now is in this position where they're trying to move back into the office. We're not quite sure how much we should be pushing people back into the office, to what extent we should be allowing people to have maybe 50% at home, 50% in the office. I've been doing, as I said, a bit of research specifically on this. And I want to just share a couple of the thoughts from this research. A beautiful quote here from one guy. He said, I used to think of the office as the place to get work done and home as the place for social stuff. And now it's the exact opposite. I don't know about you, but I come into the office these days craving social contact, trying to find people to talk to. I love my wife and my kids, but I don't want to spend 24 hours a day just with them. So there is a little bit of truth to that, but let me try to generalize from that point. I think we've got to be very thoughtful about what the office is actually good for. I've heard it called the 3 C's: collaboration, culture, and clients. And indeed, I will come back to that point on the very next slide. I think we've got to be mindful of the fact that not all employees are the same. It's very easy to project ourselves and say everybody, should be spending X number of days at home, X number of days in the office. But of course, some people just don't have that same quality, for example, of home office that you or I might have. And I've also wanted us to be thoughtful about taking advantage of those experiments that we did during that whole lockdown period. I changed from country to country, I realize. How meetings are run on, for example, online has been in many cases much more efficient than it ever was when we were working in an office environment. So in terms of how we rethink that hybrid world, this is a chart I've borrowed it with attribution from my colleague Linda Grattan. Some of you have probably seen this. She published this article in Harvard Business Review this month. And it's quite a nice way of just dimensionalizing the challenge that we are all going through right now. And I wanted to link it to something I said 5 minutes ago, which is the following, which is that we used to think of work as constrained in both time and place. We went to the office. And now, of course, we can ease up those constraints, not just in terms of where we work, but to some degree in terms of when we work. Because, of course, when we're not working in the office, there's absolutely no reason why 9 to 5 should, in fact, be the hours that we work. So if we link this chart back to what I said, as I said 5 minutes ago, it strikes me that the analytical work that we do, when we're, as it were, sat at our desks, that can indeed be done almost like anywhere at any time. It is true that the action-oriented work, the scheduling and the planning and the getting people together to get things done, there's absolutely a need for us to do that at the same time, whether we're in the office or whether we're somewhere else. We've just got to be in the same Zoom meeting. And then in terms of being constrained by place, in terms of the stuff that we do when we are actually in an office environment, for me, the relational work, the stuff that we've really struggled with over the lockdown period, that is the stuff that, of course, the office is actually pretty good for. And I want to tease out two different aspects of relational work. One is what you might call the right-hand side of collaboration and creativity, brainstorming type work. And then the bottom left might be having really difficult conversations with a colleague, firing somebody, hiring somebody, meeting a new client for the first time. Hopefully you can see how I'm structuring this. And of course, I can't tell you all the answers, but I think this is a really useful way of thinking about what do we use our offices for? What do we need to do synchronous work for? Where do we need to do synchronous work? And when can we afford to just let people go and figure it out for themselves? Okay, so my talk is in 3 parts. That was part number 2. I'm now going to spend 6 or 7 minutes on part number 3 before we move to a bit of discussion. And this part is really kind of picking up on one of the strands that I gave you at the start, which is this notion that as leaders of others, as managers or leaders of others, we often don't actually do as good a job as we think we should be doing. And figuring out how to solve that problem is something that only we can solve. Now, if you are a head of HR, one of your jobs is to help the people around you to figure it out for themselves. But I want us to start with ourselves here. I want us to say to ourselves, every one of us on this call has an opportunity to become better at doing our jobs. And rather than giving you, as it were, a checklist of things to do, because therein lies madness, as I said already, because you can't actually keep that checklist in mind, I want to give you a couple of perspectives. And those are about just changing your viewpoint on what you're doing and why you're doing it. The first one links very closely to something Aisling said earlier, which is this notion that we are trying to understand our employees better. If the definition of marketing is seeing the world through the eyes of our customers, one definition of management or leading is seeing the world through the eyes of our employees. In other words, our job is to, as it were, walk a mile in their shoes, to try to see the world from their perspective. And you might have heard that before, but let me just follow that line of thinking for a second. And it said that the Queen of England, Queen of the United Kingdom rather, that's the lady in green there, thinks that the world smells of fresh paint. And what that expression means is that she lives in a bubble. She lives her life assuming that, not assuming, but sort of living in a world where everything is beautiful, everything is perfect. The walls have been painted, the employees are lined up waiting to receive her, because every time she goes out in public, her visit is long awaited. These things are planned months, if not years in advance. She knows she's in a bubble, but she cannot break free from that bubble because of who she is. And to some degree, anybody who's in an elevated position as a manager or a leader in their organization has that same problem. It's actually quite difficult to really put yourself in the shoes of your employees, because to a large degree, the more senior you get, the people who you talk to are not actually telling you how things are. They're telling you either what they think you want them to say, or they're using this one opportunity to grouse and complain about something that they think is important for them. And there's no simple solution, but certainly the thought experiment to use is that famous TV show, I think it was Channel 4 in the UK started this, called The Undercover Boss, where the boss literally went sort of undercover in his or her own organization and discovered what a terrible job they were doing of communicating and getting the point across about how things worked. And so I do encourage all of us to almost use the concepts from the world of marketing in terms of how I try to understand my customers. And I want you to employ those things back in the workplace in terms of understanding our employees properly. And there's a whole bunch of tips and techniques, which I haven't got time to talk about here, about ways where we can sort of cut through the hierarchy, get a little bit closer to what it is that our employees are really thinking about, so that we can actually try to not just see the world through their perspective, but then shape that environment in a way that helps them to do their work better. I absolutely do accept that many of these sort of techniques are absolutely designed, if you like, for face-to-face working. Management by walking around, by definition, is a face-to-face activity. So some of these work in a virtual setting, some of them do not. Okay, let me finish with a couple of thoughts about getting to grips with our own frailties and our own biases as individuals. And this is quite a well-worn path, but let me just make a couple of points anyway. The starting point here, if you are experienced, seasoned HR professionals, you've come across this metaphor before. It is the metaphor of the elephant and the rider. Jonathan Haidt is the New York University economist, sociologist rather, who came up with this metaphor. And it's just a wonderful way of thinking about ourselves as individuals. Our minds, if you like, are both rational and emotional. And we are in control. We have a conscious mind which is steering us, but sometimes that conscious mind is not able to actually keep control of the emotional mind, the subconscious mind, which is the elephant in this metaphor. And as I think many of us have experienced over the years, as managers of others, I mean, this applies in many, many contexts, but if I'm going to put it in the context of management or leadership, I'm going to suggest the following, which is that as a manager, we know that we're meant to be giving space to others. We know that we're meant to be showering them with praise for doing a good job. We know that we're meant to be very balanced and thoughtful in our judgments. And yet, when push comes to shove, or when a crisis hits, what happens is we almost always default back to those animalistic, if you like, sort of urges or instincts, which is that we need to be in control. We want to make sure that we are on top of all the details. I want you to send me all the information so that I can review it myself. And so as managers, we know that we fall into this trap, and we just got to keep reminding ourselves to pull back from it and to say, no, I don't need to have every detail. I do need to let that person make those choices themselves. And my job is, in fact, to encourage them to figure that out rather than to do their job for them. So the elephant rider metaphor, remember it if you didn't already know it. It's a beautiful way of helping you think about these issues. So I'm going to wrap up now. A few small tips and tricks linking directly to this. The first, gosh, you've heard this before as well, but it's super relevant in this context. Given that life as a business person is about doing things to some degree on the fly, to some degree in the moment, it's almost impossible to both do things in the moment and also reflect on what we're doing. And so just as if you were a golfer trying to improve your golf swing, I do actually believe that having that impartial person to your side, giving you a bit of advice on what you did well and what you did badly, is a hugely valuable way of figuring out, what I'm doing badly and what I'm doing well, and when I'm falling into that trap of letting the elephant take over again. And then another tip, and this is, gosh, a well-traveled ground. There's a couple of famous books in front of you. Marcus Buckingham, the Strengths Finders guy, is one. Dan Cable, a colleague of mine at London Business School, is another. These people are part of what's often called the positive psychology movement. And that movement basically says, look, you are a seasoned manager or boss. You'd love to be able to do everything yourself, but you can't. So let's make sure that you understand your strengths and your weaknesses sufficiently that you then actually focus on doing the stuff that you do really well. And you make sure that you've got somebody else to your side who can help you on the things that you do less well. There's no shame in saying there's some aspects of your work that actually other people can do better than you, and for them essentially, not always, but essentially to do a lot of that stuff in your place. I'm going to finish with a beautiful quote from a movie, The Iron Lady. Some of you will have seen this movie. That's Meryl Streep pretending to be Margaret Thatcher. And towards the end of the movie, Meryl Streep is an ailing old lady, and she's asked by her doctor, how are you feeling today, Lady Thatcher? And she says, people ask me how I'm feeling. What they should be asking is how I'm thinking. And she says, you've got to actually ask me what I'm thinking, because if you look at your thoughts, they will become your actions will become your habits will forge your character, and your character will make your destiny. And she's painting a picture there of a very interesting linear process from thinking things about yourself and following through to ultimately who you become. And I'm not saying she's wrong, but I am saying that that is only one way of thinking about how you improve in the workplace. In fact, I want to propose almost the exact opposite linear sequence. You can absolutely think differently about how you do your work and act differently as a result. But I would argue that at least as powerful is doing things differently without necessarily having thought them entirely through, in order to help you make sense of the new reality, to see how people are responding to you, in order that you then make sense of it in a way that shapes your identity. You can literally act your way into a new way of thinking, rather than just thinking your way into a new way of acting. And I'm going to mention another of my colleagues. Sorry, I'm doing that quite a lot today. Hopefully you'll forgive me for that. My colleague, Herminia Ibarra, she wrote a book on this subject. It was called Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader. It captures quite nicely, I think, this notion that as leaders of others, yes, we're trying to figure out who we are, but the best way of figuring out who we are is actually to try on a number of provisional selves, a number of alternative ways of behaving with our colleagues, to see if they fit, to see if they actually help us to become better leaders and better bosses of others. So I will stop sharing there. I apologize, Mihai, if I've gone over a little bit on the time, but I think we're roughly still on schedule, and hopefully a few interesting thoughts and provocations. You don't have to believe everything I say, but to get a conversation.
So Julian, absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. And Herminia Ibarra was one of our keynote speakers a couple of years ago at the Agile Congress. So on our YouTube channel, you can actually find a video, kind of a short 20 minutes extraction from her keynote. Brilliant book. She's an absolute fabulous content. So I do recommend you to read the book, watch the video. Ladies and gentlemen, we do have some time for a question, at least one or two. So if anybody would like to ask a question or add some comment, please do make sure you place it in a chat box. And in the meantime, I'm asking Aisling, if she's still around, hopefully, to come here on the stage, because the next segment of our, and there she comes, is the actual interaction. So let's have a short panel discussion. We're kind of running out of time. And I know we could talk for hours, and I really appreciate for over 100 people still being here with us. It shows how much people are engaging with the content. So thank you so much for both of you for sharing your insight and wisdom and thoughts. It's been really brilliant, as I can see from the comments as well. And if, ladies and gentlemen, any of you have any questions to our panelists, please do put in a chat box. In the meantime, let's me starting by kicking off the conversation with a question about attrition, right? So we are getting ready for this. We talked about hybrid work. We're getting ready that hopefully the vaccination goes really well around the world. And by the way, our thoughts and prayers with families and those who are affected in India. That's absolutely horrendous. And I know many of our colleagues and friends here are from India. So I'm hopeful that they are not too badly affected with this horrendous pandemic. But hopefully situations get better and vaccination goes well in the Western world. So we're getting ready for coming back to their offices and sort of finding out what the sort of best future of work model will be. And we don't talk much about attrition. And interestingly, I had a conversation today with Andy Saigish. He's heading talent and learning at Seagate. And he mentioned to me that they are actually preparing a tsunami of attrition, where people sort of, once things become more stabilized, they will start leaving organizations, and potential companies are facing the loss of critical talent. So my question is to both of you: how do you suggest Agile should combat this tsunami of attrition ahead of us?
Ashley, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. I think that's going to be huge for us. And even in the last few months, the amount of people I've left who've just left their job or are planning to leave their job, I've never seen anything like it. It is like a tsunami of people who've just reset, rethought their lives and want something different. And I think that's where the human practices really come to play, because if we feel part of a community, which has all been broken down by things like Teams, if I'm just plugging in and out of Teams calls, well, I can do that anywhere. If I don't feel part of the team and I don't share common goals, and, I don't know what they're doing, they don't know what I'm doing, I'm just this human cog in a machine, then yeah, of course I'm going to rethink where I should spend my time. But I think that's exactly where you can craft these experiences into your performance management framework. So if your manager is dialing up recognition and appreciation, if they are checking in with the person on their well-being, on their development, one of the biggest reasons people leave, growth and development. Do we have a development goal for everyone in our organization? Does everybody have a development plan? Really simple things like that can make the difference, that you recognize me as a human around here. Do I provide a place where you can, bring voice to us? Do I pulse survey to check in how you guys are doing? So do we have that experience as crafted out for people, or is it a bit random? Is it down to, well, it depends who your manager is? Because I think that's the worst possible answer right now. We've got to ensure there's a consistent employee experience, regardless of your manager's capability to be a brilliant coach or not. And we can do that. We can create these consistent experiences by putting in some better guidance and some better tools for our managers.
Yeah, and I'll just add a couple of thoughts. As you say, it's going to be a challenge. People, as they say, leave a manager, not a company. So obviously we want individual managers, leaders to be continuing to work to understand what it is that those individuals need. And we've got to try to find opportunities for them. I'll just give you a very specific example. At London Business School, we've got two businesses, and one business is doing very well through the pandemic, and one business is struggling enormously through the pandemic. And the people who are in the business that's struggling are under the pressure. It's just brutal, because it's a sort of a loss-making business. So the thinking there is you've got to find a way of giving them opportunities in the growing piece, because there's only so much of managing in a sort of a downturn business that people can take before they move on. So to generalize from that point, I think being more proactive about giving people developmental opportunities going to different parts of those organizations is going to be important, because people are looking for a change. They're looking for some new horizon. And if you can give that within the organization, obviously that's better than having them leave the organization.
It's also a lot of responsibility on the shoulder of the individual himself or herself, as you mentioned, and connecting back to your previous talk on think and act, act and think. Yeah. Again, referring to a conversation I had with Andy, he said, yes, we are giving these opportunities to people, but are they willing to take these opportunities, especially in their case, and some of the people I've spoken with, exactly what happens. Some part of the business struggling, the other is growing. They try to create this opportunity that, hey, you need to reskill, upskill yourself. But of course, at the end, it's also down to the individual to take this, be agile, to take this sense of responsibility. How do you suggest we motivate, encourage our people to kind of leapfrog into new skills, he said?
Ashley, do you want to have a go? Or?
Yeah, sure. So, I think it's really important, because there's a lot of that theme of owning your own development and employees taking a lead. That's been around a long time. Must be talking about that 10 years. But actually employees can't until you give them a true license to. You know what I mean? It's not the most normal thing in the world to rock up and go, can I have some feedback? That just doesn't come into the working day. But if you put some tools in their hands and go, actually, we want you to go asking. In fact, we're going to do feedback Fridays, and that's the day that you should go and ask for feedback. Suddenly you normalize these habits so that employees can take ownership. But you've got to create space for it, and you've got to kind of hand them over a license to go and do these things. If your manager is the kind of manager who never shows up for a check-in, well, let the employees be able to create a check-in on the system. It shouldn't all be one way. It should be like, look, I want to check in with you, and I can do it because I've got a system here and I can go and ask for a check-in, you know?
Yeah.
So allowing them, and it's symbolic too as well, that the organization puts these tools in their hands, because the employees reading these messages all the time, we're creating symbols of who we are as a culture all the time, and there's nothing more symbolic than performance management. It screams who you are. So if you're saying to employees, oh yeah, you can just check in with your manager, but there's no real space or license to do it or tool to help you do it, then it's not really very real, is it? You know, your manager's the busiest guy in the world, you're not going to stop them. But if you've got a little tool and it's easy and you can create it, or you can create your own goals, you can create your own development goals, you can put things in, then we're starting to hand over the baton to say, it's okay, go do this. And you're empowering them to start shaping and owning their own development.
Yep. No, well said. I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay. Some questions and comments from the audience. Let's start here with Thomas. You see Thomas here in the chat box. How would you draft the value steering system focusing on generating value for employees in addition to value generation for customers and businesses?
Yeah. I mean, let me just pick up on one aspect of that, and actually, I'm sure you've got more to say. I mean, I actually did at one point start thinking exactly in those lines, along, you know, take the metaphor of the customer experience and the net promoter score. I mean, I don't think I was the first person to do this, but, you know, if the net promoter score is, you know, to what extent, you know, would you recommend this company, this product to your friends and family? You know, I actually got a company to put in place a net management promoter score, which was, to what extent would you recommend your boss as somebody, you know, your friends and family should work for? So I was actually trying to figure out a way of taking all these different kind of measures of customer satisfaction and kind of mapping them against the employee experience. And I think, actually, you were talking about the employee journey in a similar sort of way. Is that right? As a metaphor to help you to sort of structure that set of measures you might use.
Yeah, I think we have to segment it, because, you know, there's a lot of talk of let's link the employee back to the customer. There's some roles that's very easy to do, and there's that direct linear link. And then there's some roles who are there to, like, think of HR. We're here to enable the employees to deliver a great customer experience. So there's a little indirect leap for us to make there. But we can still treat everybody internally as a customer. And I think, I think marketing is a wonderful lens to use. And I love that you're using that, Julian, because I really think of HR as the inside out of marketing, if you like, you know what I mean? And if we thought like marketeers, and I remember I used to sit in board meetings and the marketing guy would come in and he'd have his own profiles of customers and their journeys and so on. Like, we can do that in HR as well. The profile of the graduate moving through our organization, the profile of the woman with 5 years experience versus the man with 10 years and so on. We can map those profiles just as easily. And if we have the right data in our hands, which we can get now through great technology, then we can have a view on how we map every one of those profiles back to the customer as well. And it could be such a powerful way to measure employee experience versus the way that we do it at the moment, which is generally via pulse surveys and engagement surveys.
Yeah. Good.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let's move on to another question which pops in my mind about there were never a shortage of HR initiatives even prior to the pandemic. But in the past 18 months, it's been, again, staying with the tsunami theme, it's been a massive tsunami of HR initiatives. Be more agile, be more team focused, be more empathetic as a leader, more focus on inclusion and diversity. So what are the options, right? As an HR leader, you can either choose to totally ignore, you get overwhelmed by these initiatives, so you can choose to ignore these initiatives. A potential worst option is that you try to chase everything and then you get nowhere. But of course, it's important somehow to rethink our work in HR or HR operating models to be able to prioritize investment in HR, human capital management initiatives. So how do you suggest we need to rethink the way we work in HR and rethink our HR operating models?
I mean, can I take this one first? I mean, I want to make a contextual point, which is, of course, Agile is is the trend of the last few years. Everyone now knows Agile, but of course you take a kind of a longer sweep, and there have been many of these trends. And the big trouble with any of these things is that they go from being a really good idea that is being well implemented in a few leading companies to being something that then gets popularized and actually sort of corrupted because it is then implemented without it being fully understood. And somebody says, we're going to do Agile this week or whatever, and that means we're just going to have a stand-up meeting, and somehow the stand-up meeting is used as a proxy for the actual concept of Agile, and somehow, not surprisingly, it doesn't work. And then when it doesn't work, people say, well, we tried Agile, it didn't work. And my point is very simple, which is that, first of all, less is more. We've got to make sure that we actually cut through all these things and figure out which one of the many possible initiatives we're going to really focus on. And then secondly, we've got to make sure that we actually train people up in understanding the essence of it rather than just the kind of the symbols around it, so that they actually are able to articulate and understand it and lead it and then take it forward and give it to others, if you see what I mean. So I don't know if that's answering the question exactly, but it seems to me that we've absolutely got to be really smart about taking one or two of these initiatives and being prepared to follow through on them, often for many years before they're actually fully embedded.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like, I've seen so many people try to put in Agile and just it being executed, like the tactics rather than the philosophy pulling right through. But I think ultimately, like, there's a big trend, like there's a lot of companies who are very focused on what's everybody else doing and what's the cool companies doing, and for me, I'm not sure that is, benchmarking and best practices. I'm not sure they provide answers, because everybody's culture is so unique. If you've got a whole culture of engineers versus a whole culture of technologists versus a whole culture of bankers, you need very different answers to your frameworks, but ultimately what you've got to do is look at how is the employee being managed in our organization with that particular profile in mind. So, whipping out ratings overnight from an engineering culture mightn't be the best thing, because they actually quite like the structure and the philosophy around ratings. So you have to bring them on a journey, whereas in another culture, they might be ready, in a more creative culture, they never want to do a rating anyway. Yeah. So I think you've got to look at the unique culture in which you operate and go, well, what's the right experience? How often should managers be given feedback? How often should they be checking in? And in those check-ins, what should they be talking about? When do we talk about performance, and how do we evaluate it? Does it need a rating? Does it not? So you can kind of tick off all these things and go, but what's right for us? And then some of the most successful programs we've had a good pleasure of being part of is where they've brought in the wider business and just kind of checked in every now and then and went, look, these are the things we're thinking of doing. What do you think? And that input from the business can be hugely valuable, but the business shouldn't direct it. We still own it. It's still HR. And I think HR still need to kind of be the drivers of the experience, but checking in every now and then and just going, this is our direction of travel. What are we thinking? Then yes, so long as we keep the ownership, because sometimes I think HR are giving away the ownership to the business, and then that really isn't right, because suddenly you've lost all the humanity around the process and you've got a maths formula to manage people, which doesn't work at all. So for me, it's about getting back to your own culture and what's right for you.
Wonderful. Well, Aisling, Julian, is there anything else you'd like to say? I was just wondering.
Well, I'm just going to make one small point, sure. Which is, it's just building on what Aisling just said. Many of you, if you've been around a few years, will remember that GE, General Electric, became very famous for Six Sigma. They didn't invent it, but they absolutely mastered it. And then all the ex-GE executives took Six Sigma to the companies that they went to next. And one of them became chief executive of 3M Corporation, which was this famously innovative company. And it kind of destroyed 3M for a while, because, of course, Six Sigma might work very well if you're trying to squeeze efficiency out of an industrial organization. But it's a terrible method if what you're trying to do is to liberate the creativity of people. So fortunately, 3M kind of found its mojo again with a different executive. But it's a great example of taking a system which works in one organization and applying it inappropriately to another.
It's a very valid comment here in the chat box with Thomas. So why do we still talk about HR?
Yeah.
When we refer to people and people experience, what does it need to take for academia to embrace a subtle, important change? from our perspective, right, we call it the HR Congress and the HR Congress Mastermind. The way we look at it, it's a brand. It's straight away people understand what we are talking about. Obviously, it's about people experience, and probably everybody hates the term HR, but it's just something which is easy to recognize. But what is your view, Aisling and Julian?
Yeah, like an awful lot of the organizations I work with have rebranded, and
Yes.
they're people in culture or people in experience or different versions of that. But I think there's a couple of terms that we could happily rebrand in HR, including performance management, which I think needs a whole new rebranding. But that's possibly a webinar for another day. Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, you go in circles on this stuff. When I was a kid, it was called personnel management, right?
Yeah, me too.
You know, and any term, whatever it is, at some point has its faults and its problems, and then someone comes up with another one. So I don't have. I guess I buy your answer. Everyone knows what HR represents, and they may not like the term, but at least they understand what it means. So.
One of our earlier events, actually, I heard, let's turn it around from HR to RH, from human resources to resourceful humans. And I really like that idea.
Exactly.
One more question, and then we need to wrap up. Often agility is just a Me Too strategy as a copy and a paste approach from better companies without real appropriation. And that's basically a comment from Charles Henry. So I'm just wondering, what's your take on that? How to avoid this copy and paste, and how to adapt, considering the culture and the current settings of an organization?
I mean, my view on that is that I don't care whether people use the term agility or not. I don't care whether people use, some of these hot terms, or not so hot anymore, like holacracy. I mean, my view is that we should almost strip away the words and try to make sure we're clear, what we're trying to achieve and how we're going to achieve it. And if what we're trying to do is to figure out a way of creating self-organizing teams who take responsibility for their own agendas, I don't care what you call it, but we build a set of activities and set of measures and techniques around that, because of course self-organizing has been around for forever under a number of different names. So I do agree that there's a risk that we use these terms without understanding them, and I guess the only reason why it's acceptable, why it's sometimes valuable to use these terms, is because it provides some security if you're trying to sell this concept to your boss. To say, I've got this crazy new idea, I don't know if it'll work, but we're just going to do it anyway. That is much less defensible than saying, I think we should put in place Agile because we've got this track record of all these other companies who've been doing Agile. So it's almost a way of legitimizing an activity that otherwise might be quite hard to sell. So that's, for me, what's going on.
I think as well that, while you may not put in place the specific Agile practices that term you an Agile organization, we can't deny that, I can't think of an organization right now who works through annual goals anymore. So everything has paced up, everything has become more agile, and maybe some of the frameworks are helpful in helping you manage that in a world that's kind of moving at pace, in a world where we have short-term goals, where we have multiple project teams, where we, where we work in a very different way than we did when we had one boss and one linear structure and one annual goal for the year. Maybe some of these concepts can be helpful, but not all of them. You got to pick and choose and see which ones fit. A bit like you were saying earlier, try out different styles to see what fits you and your organization. But for sure, Agile is here to stay, I think, because whether you deploy the methodology or not, the world has paced up and everybody is acting in a much more agile way. And we need to respond to that and change our practices to fit with that world, rather than hang on to the performance management frameworks that were built for a world that, frankly, were built in the 80s, for a world that looked very different to the one that we live in now.
Indeed, absolutely. It's not necessarily, Agile is not about Agile. HR is not about HR, as Ulrich said. I say Agile is not about Agile. It's about being able to respond to this ever fast changing environment. And we had a kind of a concept for speed of change before the pandemic, but in the last 18 months, we probably all agree it's never been faster than ever before. Charles Henry also commented on a new term, humanocracy, Gary Hamel's latest book. Gary Hamel and Michel Zanini, actually it's in my desk right here with me. Michel Zanini will be speaking at the Agile Congress in November. So it's a really good book. I do recommend. I know Julia recommended a few books, so it was my turn to finish up recommending one. Thank you, Charles Henry, for bringing our attention to this important, great publication. Ladies and gentlemen, with this, we finished our session. Thank you so much, Aisling, for joining us, and Julian for being here with us. But don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, there is an Our Tandem Lounge happening. So once you exit from this room, find our colleagues and friends at Our Tandem at the Our Tandem Lounge and keep the conversation continue. Aisling will be there, so you can have an interaction and one-on-one chat as well. Thank you so much for being here with us. Keep your eye on our future emails, because many more mastermind sessions are coming up in the near future. Take care. Goodbye. Have a great evening. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.